Hello everybody, today potentially the most controversial entry in my Cool Cars for Young People series. For here we have a 1996 E38 generation BMW 730i, complete with short-lived but rather wonderful 3-litre V8. Yeah. And though I think it's fairly easy to see why any young person would see this as a kinda cool car, because they do like retro things. After all, it's young people I meet today that love Volvos, not old ones. The tricky part is going to be trying to explain why this 19-year-old economics student believes it's not just cool, but actually sensible. Is he right? Or is it merely the folly of youth? Well, find out in today's episode of JayEmm on Cars. So, if at the end of today's episode you find yourself headed towards the classifieds in search of your perfect old school BMW, don't forget to take CarVertical with you, because if there is anything out there likely to have led a hard life, it's something a bit like this. And in just 60 seconds, CarVertical could save you from making a rather costly mistake. For 20% off the service, don't forget to use my discount code JayEmm. And now onto the task at hand. And for those who don't speak BMW, what exactly is an E38 730i? Well, the 7 Series I'm sure you're familiar with, BMW's top-flight luxury flagship. They're equivalent to the Mercedes S-Class, the Audi A8, and latterly the Lexus LS. It has been around now for quite some time, and amongst aficionados, the E38 is considered to be one of the very best. Why? Because it was the last to feature the classic BMW looks, very similar to those of the E36 3 Series, of which Luke previously owned an example, and the much-loved E39 5 Series. This generation of 7 Series took over from the old E32, which was the last to have the classic 4-round headlights, and it landed in 1994, being in production until 2001, when it was replaced with the almost universally unloved E65 and E66 generation, of which I once owned an example. That car was a real technological tour de force. It was the car in which BMW really decided to take the fight to Mercedes. This, by some, could be viewed more simply as an upmarket 5 Series, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. It even had a starring role, being a Bond car in the film Tomorrow Never Dies. Remember that one? It's the one where he controls it off his phone. Back then, proper science fiction. Today, YouTubers do it for fun. And I think it is fair to say that both the charm and also the curse of the 7 Series is that, like a great many luxury flagships, it was very expensive when new, often packed with interesting and innovative technology. In the case of this, it was the first European car to have sat-nav, the first car, full stop, to have curtain airbags, and you could option things like soft closed doors, double glazing. They even later did a limousine variant, and you could also have the car in a couple of different armoured variants, the protection spec and then full security spec. Those today I wouldn't recommend buying unless you've got a few people that really don't like you. I might get one to take to an Abarth meet. Anyway, the problem with these cars is that yes, they are nice, expensive and luxurious when new, but they depreciate very quickly. And it is the case that one of these, though it might have cost twice or 3 times as much as a 3 Series when new, after only, say, 5 or 6 years, could be as expensive as a second-hand 3 Series, and in some cases, even cheaper. And the thing is, they're still underneath high-end luxury cars. They will cost money to run. Now, one of the reasons that the E38 is rather well loved is that it's generally accepted, provided you haven't bought a particularly crusty example, it'll likely be a fair bit cheaper to run than its successor. Though that, even I consider to be a wallet-busting car. the E38 is certainly going to be a little bit easier on the bank balance, but none of these are the sort of car that the faint of heart should buy. And so it was with great surprise that I saw Luke's email telling me that he, at just 19 years old, had bought one. And I am sure that you must have the exact same thoughts that I did. First off, how much did he pay for this? And secondly, how does he afford the insurance? Well, that is the first pleasant surprise. He paid just £3,000 for the car. Before it, he had an E36 316i, and before that, he had a Volvo V50. Oddly, I think most young people now would probably prefer to own the old Volvo. He got into BMWs because he loved touring cars in the 1990s, and yes, I did point out to him the irony that he got rid of his Volvo and got into a BMW because of 90s touring cars, but clearly he was looking at a different bit of the 1990s to the rest of us. Regardless, the real shock was how much it costs him to insure. Considering he is just, I'll say it again, 19 years old, a male, which officially speaking today shouldn't count against him, but I'm sure probably still does. More than that though, he has a London postcode and he's got it insured for 20,000 miles a year. And even with all of that declared, it costs him just £1,200. For a young person full stop, that's cheap. And even compared with the cooking variety of Fiesta, let alone an ST, that was around half what he'd pay for a car that he didn't consider anywhere near as desirable. Naturally, maintenance and running costs are going to be quite a bit more expensive, particularly when you've got a V8 to feed. And I have to confess that I did kind of forget this was a V8, because I'm sure you, like me, when you see 730, you just assume that's the 3-litre straight 6. But that engine hadn't actually come out when this car was built. Instead, if you did want a 6-cylinder petrol, you only had one choice, and that was the 728i. Itself a brilliant engine, but for luxury appeal, the V8 is where it's at. Now I know, you could have also got this car with a V12. In fact, it tells you just how old this car is, that the engine lineup was one 6-cylinder, then a bunch of V8s, and finally a 12. If you did want a diesel, and this was the first generation of 7 Series to offer one, they did give you a few options. A 725, then later I think a 740 with a V8, unusual for BMW. But I don't see any reason why you would want one of those. I'm sure they were decent enough in their day, but that was a long time ago. The iconic BMW straight 6 though, still worth buying, and these earlier V8s also far less problematic than their successors. And I'm actually fairly familiar with this engine. Its code name is M60, and it was the first V8 that BMW had made in quite some time. It was designed to replace, in certain cars, the old 3.5i engine, their iconic straight 6, which by this point had become increasingly elderly and simply didn't meet emissions regulations anymore. So they built the V8, I think with one eye on the American market, and in most guises you'll know it as the 740i or 540i, whichever it was that you were looking at. It also made an appearance in the 8 Series as well, and it's a decent engine. First displaced 4 litres, later 4.4. However, the lesser known and very short-lived, only in production from about 1992 to 1996 3-litre variant is a bit of a peach. Apparently some really like it for its tunability. Because it's much stronger than the 4-litre, you can strap a supercharger to it, though today that'd feel just like cruelty. And I know some might be tempted to go in for something like the 12-cylinder, the 750i, but they are more complicated, the car is heavier, and it doesn't even make that much more power. The 740i, for example, makes around 286 horsepower, but the 750i only another 40 on top, so only about another 10 horses per cylinder. Not a lot. This, meanwhile, the 730, and between the two there was also a 735, makes just 215 horsepower. Torque, 214 pounds-feet. That's about 290 newton meters. Combine that with a curb weight of 1.8 tons, it's over 2 for the 12, and expectations should be set fairly low. But that being said, I am now on my favourite little slice of B-road, and so I owe it to all of you and to Luke, who wants to know how I feel about the car, to try and put it through its paces and see what it's got. There is no manual mode for this gearbox. Instead, you can either lock it into second, third or fourth, but what we do have is a sport mode for it. That will make it a little keener to kick down. I've engaged that. We're going to put my foot down and see what she's got. Response from the gearbox is actually pretty decent. The thing does like to rev out, but in all honesty, performance, not stellar. I'd love to tell you exactly how quick it is that I'm going, but I can't, because the speedo has died. And this is the bit where I need to be brutally honest about the car, because not only is it my job, it is also my responsibility to all of you. And the truth is, when it comes to this particular example, it's about half and half, good and bad. Let's get through the bad first, shall we? This car belonged once to Luke's friend, who had it amongst a few other things and then one day decided he needed to sell it. Luke had once previously driven it, kind of fallen in love with it, and bought it for the princely sum of £3,000. As you can tell from the state of the roof, it's a little bit patinated. There are pieces of interior trim now beginning to fall apart. The passenger seat in particular looks quite distressed, and I'd love to be able to tell you exactly how many miles it's got, but the display down here has died. So let's just say a lot. The ABS has also packed up. That I am sure is related to the fact that the speedo is not working, and when I went to go and do my review earlier, we started the car and then it died. It has also begun to creak quite a bit from the rear, and it's sat on a set of 12-year-old Kumo tyres. As it happens, I have recently introduced a new policy where if I have a car brought to me with tyres any older than 10 years, I'm not going to drive it. But I made one last exception today for Luke, partly because he's come all the way out here, but also because I didn't really think it was going to be much of a problem. Allow me now to check my theory. Yeah, it's not. The car simply does not have the go in a straight line to give even these ancient things any trouble whatsoever. You'll forgive me for not throwing it round a bend with careless abandon, but that was never really the 7 Series bag anyway. But being fair to the young man, this car has a nearly complete toolkit in the back, the original first aid kit, which is probably best not used, the factory fit fire extinguisher under my seat, and he's even gone to the trouble of refitting the torch in the glove box. Something that often vanishes over time, but is a really cool hallmark of BMWs of this era. He did buy it knowing that a few things needed tending to, and in his defense, he has been working his way through the issues. So the catalytic converter has already been replaced with a newer and better one, though even so, the car doesn't really make that much noise. Put your foot down and you do get a little bit of distant V8 rumble, and in some of the drive-bys you can kind of hear it, but I respect the fact that he is being sensible and as a young person leaving it standard. Not only for reasons of insurance, but also because this is a 7 Series. He himself has noted that if you did want to modify one of these, there are nowhere near as many parts available for it as a 3 or even a 5. That's just because it's that kind of car. And that is also the reason why, though a manual was technically available for the E38, the last 7 Series to offer one, this and just about every other doesn't have it. Instead, it's got a 5-speed ZF torque converter automatic, which, though I know it's not the gearbox you want to live out your transporter fantasies with a manual, well, the fact is, though they did offer it, I don't think they offered it in all markets, and they definitely didn't offer it with all engines. So if you were waiting for that unicorn manual V12 7 Series to come up for sale, you're going to be waiting for quite some time. Regardless, the box does a fairly decent job. In sport mode, it's letting it rev reasonably high, and apparently I'm doing 70 to the gallon as well. Though I think that might also be a function of the fact that the speedo has died. Actual economy, well, around town it's going to be pretty bad, single digit to teens, and on a run you might get somewhere in the 20s. Handily, it's got an enormous fuel tank, 85 litres, meaning that at least the range is good, even though every time he does go to Shell, it hurts. As you would expect of a 7 Series, even though this isn't the long wheelbase version, there is still plenty of legroom in the back, and the boot's a very good size too, which is often not the case for many later luxury cars. They usually don't have as much space as the model below them, but this one's good. It's broad and it's fairly uniform in size, so for an airport run or a nice week away, it'd be perfect. And extra cool points to the young man for sticking a copy of the Financial Times and a couple of champagne flutes in the back. That is class. And it's also pretty clear that this particular car was never very highly specified. You don't have the double glazing that was optional. You don't have the wonderfully old school car phone in the middle, nor a port in the back for a fax machine that my dad's old 7 Series had. He bought a much later 2000 735 E38, had it for 6 months, sold it, and then regretted, because it was a brilliant car for very little money, and it never really put a foot wrong. I think he had to give it a new battery. That was about it. But that was also 15 years ago, when it was a much more youthful car. Today, even the youngest of all E38s is going to be 24 years old. And so things like the dual zone climate control might not work properly. I think the aircon in here may be on the fritz. It may not, but it also may. At least the little pop-up flap here hiding the cassette player works, even if it is rather vicious. Ugh. And so it would be very, very easy to simply look at a car like this and go, yeah, a little bit crusty, a little bit patchy here and there. You are going to spend the purchase price on this instantly. It's just not worth it, is it? I'd rather go and buy a 5 Series or a 3 Series, going to be dynamically far superior. But hear me out. This car is actually a little bit wonderful. Sure, the brakes may pulsate, the rear may creak like an old antique cart, and, well, whatever happened to the cover of this sunroof up here, let's just say I'm glad it can't talk. But set that aside, come down to the business of driving, and this thing is a joy. Even sat on suspension that is almost certainly past its best, it is comfortable, it is pleasant. It's got that iconic German style about it, not shouty, not fussy. It currently wears no badge on the back. You wouldn't guess at a quick glance that this was a 7 Series if you didn't know your BMWs. From in here though, everything feels just a cut above the 5 Series of the day. Everything in here is a little bit nicer. And in the context of modern day cars, it's not enormous. It sits at just under 5 meters long, but more importantly, it's not particularly broad. This means that out here on country B roads, which are not the natural environment of a 7 Series, it doesn't feel out of place. The 5-speed gearbox goes between ratios nicely and smoothly. And though the engine doesn't have much performance on tap, you could of course get a bigger, more powerful one, and it will at least give you everything it's got readily and keenly. One of the last things that I reviewed was a Cupra Formentor, a car near 30 years this one's junior, and that pulling away at junctions was a far more fussy affair. Dual clutch gearbox, modern, small, turbocharged engine, and it just struggled. This meanwhile, put your foot down and it just goes. There is a magic about the combination of a torque converter auto and a big, naturally aspirated multi-cylinder engine that is really difficult to beat. In fact, I think in terms of smoothness at low speed, the only thing better is an EV. And one of the biggest surprises, the steering. I wouldn't exactly say it's feelsome, because it isn't, but it has an awful lot more heft than I was expecting. The rear's not happy. There is some clunking going on. There are things about this car that are not right. Frustratingly, next week it's getting new tyres and a few other things too, and I've no doubt once Luke gets it in the air he's going to realise other things require tending to. But his mission with this, and I'll give him credit, not many young people think this way, is to get it mechanically sorted before he even thinks of any kind of modification. Well done, young man. That's the way to do it. And this review has actually come at a very opportune moment because I do still consider myself a bit of a BMW fan. Their recent output has been, let's be frank about it, ugly, and in terms of the drive, a little bit mixed. But I still have masses of respect for their heritage. And I have owned more BMWs than any other brand, 9 in total. I'm currently on the hunt for my next sensible daily. So I need something with 4 seats and 4 doors. And of course, I keep doing the usual thing. I start off by looking at something nice and sensible, like a Mondeo, and 5 minutes later, I'm looking up E39 M5s. And I still like the idea of an E39 M5, but the reason that I haven't committed to buying one of those is partly they're a lot of money and they're likely all going to be knackered, but it's the fact that they are manual. And though for most people I know that's a selling point, what I'm after is my London car, the thing I use to go into town. So I want an automatic. And though every now and again I keep thinking about buying back not just a car like my old 7 Series, but that exact car, I do then start looking at other things too, other variations, both newer and older. The thing is that up until now, the one thing stopping me looking seriously at an E38 is the fact I assumed that they were not ULEZ compliant. But it turns out that some of them may be, including, believe it or not, the 750i. So perhaps it is time for me to consider another V12 daily after all. There is something desperately cool about this car. It's understated. It's nice inside, it won't cost quite as much as a later one to run. It's a compelling package, it has to be said. And the only other cars of this type and generation that I'd give serious consideration are the old Lexus LS, but I actually prefer the later ones. From a luxury perspective, they're just better. Or, and this is a very, very cool car, the D2 generation Audi S8, the one from Ronin. They're impossibly cool, but it's been a long time since I've driven one of those. Audi did have one in the heritage fleet. Shall I give them a call, see if they do still? I think they do. Anyway, that is my take on this patinated but honest and certainly loved BMW E38 730i. I want to say a huge thank you to Luke for bringing it out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.